Have you ever heard of a war so destructive it felt like a nightmare that just wouldn't end? Well, today we're talking about the 30 Years' War, a conflict that tore Europe apart and, believe it or not, helped create the world we live in today. Let's get into it. You heard that right. This massive, continent-spanning war, which would cost millions of lives, literally started when a few guys got tossed out of a window. So, how in the world does something like that lead to a 30-year war? First, let's just let that sink in. 30 years. That means an entire generation of people was born, grew up, and had families, all while this war was raging. For them, constant conflict was just normal life. It's pretty hard to wrap your head around. Okay, so to figure this all out, we need to zoom in on the heart of Europe. We're talking about a place that wasn't really a single country like we think of today. It was this huge, jumbled collection of territories. This place was called the Holy Roman Empire. And you got to remember this part. It wasn't really holy, it wasn't Roman, and it was definitely not a unified empire. It was more like a giant, messy patchwork quilt of hundreds of little states, all ruled by different people. And the whole thing was basically a powder keg, mostly because of deep divisions between two religious groups, the Catholics and the Protestant. So you've got this powder keg just sitting there. What was the spark that finally lit the fuse? Well, it all goes back to that window I mentioned, in a castle in the city of Prague. And here it is, the moment that changes everything. A group of really angry Protestant officials march into Prague Castle and throw the emperor's two Catholic representatives right out of a window. They fell 70 feet, but they survived. Now, the Catholics immediately said it was a miracle, that angels swooped down and saved them. The Protestants, though, had a slightly less glamorous explanation. They said the guys just got lucky and landed in a giant, soft pile of horse manure. Now, you'd think that would be the start of the war, right? But not quite. The rebellion was actually put down pretty fast. The emperor's forces won a huge victory at the Battle of White Mountain, and it looked like the whole thing might be over. But this defeat just made the Protestants really, really desperate for help. And that's when this local fight started to spiral out of control. Other countries looked at the chaos and saw an opportunity. Suddenly, everyone wanted to get involved, and the stakes were about to get way higher. So at this point, the Protestant side was really on the ropes. Their rebellion had failed, and an attempt by Denmark to help them had also ended badly. The empire's armies seemed totally unstoppable. The Protestants, they needed a hero. And they got one. All the way from Sweden, a new player entered the game. His name was Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden. He was known as the Lion of the North, and he was about to completely change the course of the war. So what made the Swedish army so special? Well, their king was a military genius. He totally updated his army with new tactics and technology. They had these lighter cannons that could actually move around during a battle, which was a huge deal back then. His army was disciplined, motivated, and they absolutely saved the Protestant cause from being completely wiped out. But even with Sweden's help, the war just kept grinding on. And as it did, it became less about big, heroic battles and more about sheer, brutal survival. And the people who paid the biggest price, well, they weren't the soldiers. See, most of the armies weren't fighting for a flag or a country. They were made up of mercenaries. These were professional soldiers who fought for whoever had the money to pay them. Their only loyalty was to their paycheck, which meant armies could switch sides and the whole war became this chaotic, destructive free-for-all. And think about this. These huge armies didn't have supply trucks bringing them food. So how did they eat? They just took whatever they wanted from the villages they passed through. They were like a swarm of locusts, stripping the countryside bare. For regular people, seeing an army marching your way, any army, was a complete disaster. So after all this time, who really suffered the most? It wasn't the kings or the generals. No, it was the ordinary people, the farmers, the villagers, the families, who were just trying to live their lives. The numbers are just staggering. In some parts of what is now Germany, more than half the population was gone. Just gone. Let that sink in. And sometimes for every 2 people, one of them died, not just from the fighting, but from the starvation and disease that the war left behind. It's a level of destruction that's hard to even comprehend. All right, so just when you think this war can't get any more complicated, it takes a massive turn.
Over time, the fighting stopped being about religion. It became a cold, calculated game of power between Europe's biggest players. And this is the biggest plot twist of the entire war. All of a sudden, Catholic France, a major European power, jumps into the fight, but on the side of the Protestants. Wait, what? How does that even make sense? Well, it wasn't about religion anymore. It was all about politics. France was run by a clever and ruthless guy named Cardinal Richelieu. He was Catholic, sure, but he was more worried about his rivals, the powerful Habsburg family who led the Catholic side of the war. His goal was simple: weaken the Habsburgs and make France the #1 power in Europe. And he didn't care that this decision would drag the war on for many more years. So after 3 decades of pure devastation, Europe was completely shattered. But out of all that destruction, a totally new kind of Europe and a new way of thinking about the world was about to emerge.
By the 1640s, pretty much everyone had had enough. The land was destroyed, the money was gone, and the people were just exhausted. It was finally time to talk about peace. That talk led to a huge peace settlement called the Peace of Westphalia. This was a really big deal. It redrew the map of Europe, formally recognizing countries like Switzerland. It gave people more religious freedom, but most importantly, it introduced a powerful new idea. And that idea is called sovereignty. Basically, it's the rule that each country gets to be the boss of its own territory. No other country is supposed to interfere with what goes on inside your borders. It's like a giant "do not enter" sign for nations. It might seem obvious to us now, but back then, it was a revolutionary idea. And it became the foundation for how countries interact to this very day. So the 30 Years' War was a major turning point. It was the last of the great European wars of religion, but it also kicked off a new era of wars fought for political power and national interest. And it leaves us with a pretty big question, right? We may have stopped fighting over which church to go to, but have we really learned how to stop fighting altogether?